And welcome back to the UCSS studios. Mikey McNuggets, Jason Lloyd here. We're doing Ultimate Cavs in studio because when we have breaking news, well, we got to hop on and talk about it. We spent an hour on the show today, Jason, but it would not be appropriate for us to have a head coach get fired over the team that we have a dedicated podcast to and us not hop on said dedicated podcast and talk about it. JB Bickerstaff, there were rumblings. It took a week and 1 day. The decision is now final. The Cavs have parted ways with JB Bickerstaff. At the end of the day, Jason, it feels like there was the only move the team had to make, unless they decided to go rogue and say, screw everyone else. We're doing it our way.
Yeah.
No outside influences, and we're going to run it back, but they decided to make a change.
I actually really would have respected that if they said, everybody knock it off. We're a good team. We're not making any changes. The media block all that crap out. We're not addressing that stuff. And I'm talking about the story that we wrote, obviously. If they said, we're running this back, guys, shut up and go get back to work. I would have really respected that. It's not how it typically goes in today's NBA. I wrote about it. We talked about it on the show. I don't believe Koby Altman wanted to fire JB. I feel like he felt like he had no choice. Whether he did or not is another debate. I don't believe he felt like he had any other choice.
Yeah, it obviously took 8 days from the end of the Cavs-Celtics series to the result we got today.
Which tells you he didn't really want to do it, or it would happen the next day.
And I tried saying that last week, or earlier this week at the end of last week, if they had a decision beforehand, we all picked the Celtics to beat the Cavs. The Cavs losing was not an upset that no one saw coming. If they had thought prior to the series that JB Bickerstaff was over and done with, he probably would have been fired the next day. We saw Frank Vogel get fired as soon as the Suns lost to the Timberwolves. Immediately gone. We've seen other coaches get fired immediately
Darvin
after.
Ham.
This took 8 days to figure out, and it could be some travel. It could have been decisions. It could be Dan Gilbert being involved. We don't know why exactly it took 8 days, but the fact it did took 8 days, Jason, to me at least that signals there was some sincere, high-level discussions over whether or not JB was the right guy to lead the Cavs to the promised land or not, and eventually they came to the conclusion JB wasn't that guy.
This is not hyperbole. I mean this. You cannot ask for a better human being to represent your franchise than what JB Bickerstaff is. And it's hard to just dismiss that. This isn't a guy who is trying to go on some power play. He's not a guy who's trying to go behind his front office's back. He's not a guy who's interested in all of that other stuff that a lot of head coaches are, frankly. And we talked about on the show today, if you want to keep JB Bickerstaff, you can make a case to keep him.
Yep.
If you want to fire JB Bickerstaff, you can make that case to fire him. And ultimately it came down, I believe, to the players. And I've felt all year long, all the intel we were getting, particularly as the playoffs progressed, was the players are done with him and he's therefore not going to be able to survive. And, you don't necessarily have to like your player. You can't say that he didn't get everything he could out of this roster in terms of how far they made it. Nobody in their right mind would pick the Cavs to beat the Celtics in that series, particularly with Donovan Mitchell at far less than 100%, and then eventually out of the series with Jarrett Allen missing the series. And by the end, Karis LeVert also missing. And for them to compete and play as hard as they did and push the Celtics as much as they did is a credit to him and his coaching and his tenacity. When you talk about how many times the Cavs say this year, they don't ever quit. They keep coming, and they keep coming, and they keep coming. That's a testament to the coaching. Yes, his offense could have been better, should have been better. No, they were not good enough offensively in the playoffs. When you can't even score 100 points in the playoffs, that's a major problem. I tend to think it's probably a fixable problem if you make a couple staff changes. I don't know that you necessarily have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but because of the locker room situation, and we talked about it on the show, I don't care what you hear over the next 48 hours, the players were done with JB. That's ultimately what this comes down to. And that falls on Donovan. Whether he wants to accept it or not, whether he wants to embrace it or not, that falls on him because the team is going to follow their leader. No matter which line he gets in, everybody else in that locker room follows. And we heard too many things from players too low on that roster to have an opinion on the coach the way that they did. It got too far down the line to where I was like, this is crazy. You don't have enough juice in this league to be saying some of the things that we're hearing that's being said, and that's ultimately what it came down to.
Not just things you were hearing, but go back to the 26-point fourth quarter lead they blew against the Clippers.
Yeah.
And players who aren't superstars by any means, were outwardly criticizing and questioning their defensive strategies in that game. Once that stuff gets out, it's really hard to put it back in the bag. And to your point on Donovan, since the UCSS show has ended, we've seen two prominent members of the media, one megastar in the media and one former player, come out and kind of echo what you have said. Chandler Parsons on the Run It Back show with Shams. It's a FanDuel program.
Yeah.
Parsons did play for JB Bickerstaff in Memphis.
Yep.
He came out, and this is his exact quote, and I want to read this word for word, and I quote from Chandler Parsons, "Donovan Mitchell, you got what you wanted, so now all the pressure is on you. This is a bullshit firing," end quote. That's direct. That is
a former
former player, and alludes to some stuff that we talked about earlier on players falling out of favor with JB and JB falling out of favor with them. And then Stephen A. Smith, who is arguably the biggest personality in the sports world right now, came out and said JB Bickerstaff did not deserve to be fired by the Cavs. What he had done for this organization since taking over in 2020, their constant progression was enough, in his opinion, to keep his job. Now, you could agree, you could disagree, but there are certainly people making the case that this was not the right move for the Cavs' future. And they have some validity, but I think people who have been up close and personal with the Cavs organization, and at least my 2 cents, there are coaches that can get you to the club, and there's coaches that can get you into the club.
Yeah.
And I think JB's a great escort to get you to the club. I'm not sure he's taking you into the club you want to get to, which is the Eastern or Western Conference Finals and eventually an NBA championship.
It doesn't mean they're going to get better. They got to get this right. This is such a critical hire, obviously, for a variety of reasons. You can go the route. I mean, the Bucks basically said, Giannis, who do you want? And he picked Adrian Griffin, and it was a disaster.
Correct.
Total disaster. It was. I was talking to people in Milwaukee.
LeBron with Frank Vogel in L.A.
Yeah.
Darvin Ham, not much better.
Yeah. So when you leave it up to the players, it can end in disaster. But you know, the critical summer for the Cavs, you have a decision to make on Evan Mobley on a contract extension. You have a decision to make on Isaac Okoro, and obviously the biggest one is Donovan Mitchell up for an extension. And this is a very fragile time to be having a coaching search when you have a star that, frankly, you're trying to appease. And we'll see how this goes.
We mentioned on today's UCSS show a full list of potential candidates. So, Jason, we'll spend 2 minutes on this before we move on to the next part, because if you want to see our full list, there's a couple names. There's a few more we mentioned, Mike Inori, David Adelman from the Nuggets, as other guys that may be getting some consideration. Maybe it's a Frank Vogel, a Mark Jackson, who knows. If you want to see that full conversation, go to our YouTube page. We spent 20 minutes on the candidates, some of their pros and cons. But, Jason, in your mind, is there a clear-cut number one candidate? And if not a clear-cut, who are your top 3 people that you would like to see personally get a shot at this job?
The name that keeps coming up the most is Kenny Atkinson, the name on the top of the list. That was his picture there attached to that list. That seems to be, for whatever stock you want to put into it, that's everything that we've been hearing for a couple of weeks now, frankly. He would be the number one top option. James Borrego is another name that keeps coming up over and over again. Jaeger is one I just find interesting because he was here just not that long ago. He was just here a couple of months ago.
This season.
And that was not – I don't believe that was JB's decision to bring Dave into the organization. The way it was explained to me was it was over his head that they brought Dave in as sort of an extra set of eyes. And then I thought he was sort of the coach in waiting. He would have gotten the job had JB been fired during the season. When it became evident that wasn't the case, he left and went back with Doc and took the job in Milwaukee. Heard a lot of good things about Jaeger, though. So that's just sort of a name that's not really been mentioned a lot, but just one I'd sort of keep on the periphery.
Yeah, I think Atkinson's the name I've heard the most as well. He had success in Brooklyn. He has ties to some of the guys currently on the Cavs staff.
Yep.
I'm not sure he's an elite head coach. I'm not sure he's a bad head coach. He took over a terrible Brooklyn Nets team, made them competitive, took them to the playoffs, and then as soon as the stars came in, Kyrie and KD, they said, we don't like Kenny, and shipped him out. So that I'm a little hesitant knowing what we just experienced here in Cleveland, how that match would work. But he's a name I've heard many times. Borrego also, I think, got a raw end of the deal in Charlotte. Those teams weren't good, but he's a highly regarded offensive mind in this league. Comes from the Spurs system. Chris Quinn's a guy I really like. You mentioned Jaeger. I also don't know a ton about him, but this Mike Inori guy from Minnesota, the way they play defense, the way they've accelerated this rebuild process. Hey, Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert got traded off the same team in the same offseason, and look where one team is and look where the other team is now. One team's way on the way up. The other team's about to go through colossal change this offseason, And Mike Inouye has been the right-hand assistant, the number 2 guy behind Chris Finch on that bench. So he interests me as well, but he's more known as a defensive guy, to my understanding, than an offensive guy. And I think whoever they bring in probably has to be an offensive guy because, in my opinion, priority number 1 is developing Evan Mobley.
Absolutely.
And finding out if he can be that quote-unquote unicorn you thought you were getting with the 3rd overall pick in the 2021 draft.
Yeah, and we talked about that on the show today. If, what are you looking for? The pendulum always swings on these things. JB was very much a defensive guy. I would expect to be more of an offensive mind coming in. And you have to figure out what you have in Evan Mobley once and for all. We are at that point. Like, it's time for him to become whatever it is he's going to be on the offensive end. I think you saw it in that Boston series, what it could look like with him at center. Now, Boston didn't have a lot of size on the other side. It's important to point that out. But Evan really never got the chance this year to play without Jarrett next to him because Jarrett played in 77 straight games. So what does this look like with Evan and 4 shooters around him? You kind of got a glimpse of that. If the new coach can build on that and figure that out, that's probably your guy.
2 more things we're going to touch on here on the Ultimate Cavaliers show. Jason, we saw the first domino fall now in the Cavs offseason. That was the dismissal of JB Bickerstaff. What's the second domino to fall? What's next in this offseason of change for Cleveland?
I mean, obviously hiring a coach. That's next. And picking the right guy, whether or not you want to consult with Donovan on that, I'm sure that they will, especially if he wants to stay here. And that, to me, is the next big domino. So I'm gonna lump all of the coaching stuff into one domino. And then the next step after that is secure a commitment from Donovan. And all the information that we've gotten over the last couple of weeks is that he probably will resign. Now, we'll see what the fallout of this is because Donovan's taken a lot of heat on this, probably more than he thought he would. When you mentioned Stephen A. and Chandler Parsons calling him out by name, and, I think I saw Brian Windhorst said something very similar to what I've said, that's going to fall on him. And we'll see if that influences his decision at all. But up until now, the information has been that he's going to resign. If you get that commitment from him, now you can go about looking at the rest of this roster, what works, what doesn't. Do we need to break off 1 or 2 of these pieces and reshape this? Do we run this back as is? But none of that matters until you know where you're going with Donovan Mitchell.
I think it is a silly exercise to expect the Cavs to make a head coaching hire, and I'll get to whether or not Koby's part of that decision or not, without consulting and making sure it's a guy Donovan Mitchell likes.
Yeah.
It is malpractice from an organizational standpoint if they do not consult with their superstar player who's up for a massive contract extension, 4 years, $208 million if he signs this summer, to not consult him on who he wants to at least be his head coach moving forward. We are hearing that JB and Donovan may not have seen eye to eye on a lot of things. And if you're going to re-sign for 4 years potentially, which gives you 5 more years in Cleveland, at least on paper, you better be comfortable with the head coach you're playing for. So that is the next domino, is what is Donovan's future? And I guess that's really the third domino because hiring a head coach is the second domino. And Jason, before we get to the last thing, my question to you is, and you may not know of at 100% certainty, and by all means tell us, is Koby the one making that hire?
That's a complicated question, and I want to back up real quick before we get to it because it is important to note that there's a draft in between. And this is their last number 1 pick that they control for the next 5 years because they're just now entering, starting next year, the payment for that Donovan trade. And so there is a draft in between, but I would suspect by the time of the draft, they will know Donovan's intentions one way or the other.
They better.
You
have to because
you at least have to have, if you don't have a definitive yes or no, you at least have a pretty strong impression of the way this thing's going.
And my gut tells me there's a good chance he does resign now.
Yeah.
I know that's swayed. The pendulum is going back and forth in that decision. By the draft, you'll have a head coach.
Yeah.
For sure. I would hope. I mean, there's no way this can drag out that long. And part of the thing with Mike Inouye, which is why I didn't put him on the initial list, they're still playing. And these interviews are going to start happening now.
Yeah.
And if they don't hire a coach in a week, 10 days, Mike Inouye might be the guy they're waiting for because he's still coaching and won't obviously accept the job until the Timberwolves are out of the playoffs. But by the draft, we'll know who the head coach is. We'll know who the general manager is if they decide to make a change at that position. I don't expect them to, but if they do.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll know Donovan's future because I don't feel like you can go into that draft without knowing Donovan's future.
Yeah. Now to the question of who's making this call, we talked about it a little bit on the show, but before he had the health issues, Dan always had one guy in mind that he vigorously pursued and went after, and if he got him, that was the guy, and if he didn't, I talked about in 2010 when they fired Mike Brown, Dan aggressively pursued Tom Izzo. Obviously, he's a Michigan State guy. Loved Izzo, wanted him for the job, threw everything he could at him. Tom ultimately chose to stay. So Dan went to his front office at the time and said, go get the best guy available. And they wound up with Byron Scott. And then Dan did get his guy in David Blatt. He did get his guy in John Beilein, and those were absolute disasters. And the front office had to sort of backfill that. And when David Blatt was hired to be the coach, Ty Lue was brought in as the insurance policy. When John Beilein was hired as the coach, JB Bickerstaff was brought in as that insurance policy. I believe things have changed now to where Koby's probably going to lead and direct this thing start to finish. It's how it should be. And if I think you'll be able to tell by the hire who really fired the shot on that. Hopefully, Dan has seemed to put a lot of faith and trust into Koby to this point with all facets of the organization. And now this is Koby's hire to make. I would suspect, I don't know that for certain, but I would suspect with the way that the Cavs have operated since Dan is back. Like, Dan has returned now to a much more active role in the organization. He's recovered from the stroke as much as he will to this point. Like, this is it. This is his life going forward. So he's recovered as much as he's going to. He is back in sort of a chair of power, but this is not the same Dan. Can't stress that enough. This is not the same Dan as it was prior to the health issues.
I also agree that Koby Altman feels like he's safe in this scenario.
Oh, he's safe.
Yeah, he will be the one making it.
There was a time I wasn't entirely sure of that, but he is safe.
I get the same sense from talking to people. Well, and with this, Jason, there are 3 now head coach openings in the NBA. Washington, who for the sake of this, we're going to throw out because they're in a completely different barrel.
Yeah.
JB also makes a lot of sense in Washington, if we're being totally honest. But that's the discussion for another day. The Lakers and the Cavs. If you were a head coaching candidate, if Jason Lloyd was being courted to be the head coach of either LeBron James and the Lakers or Donovan Mitchell and the Cavs, which of those 2 jobs to you do you think is more appealing to potential head coaching candidates?
Cavs. I think the Cavs job is more – we talked about it on the show today. This is a good job. This is a young roster. It's trending in the right direction. They've made progress every year. They're especially – I mean, if you're a head coaching candidate, obviously you want to know the future of Donovan. You want to know if you're going to have Donovan or not. But there's a lot to work with here. There's a lot to build on. Even if they break 1 or 2 of these pieces off in trades, you're going to get value back for them. So this is a really appealing job. The Lakers job, I don't think is that appealing. You have an aging superstar in LeBron, and I've heard from so many coaches, one of the most difficult things to do is to coach an aging superstar who can't do what he once did. And let's be honest, LeBron, for as phenomenal as he still is, it's unbelievable what he's doing. This is not prime LeBron any longer.
He's top 10, not top 1.
Yeah, and so it's hard to coach those guys as the decline sets in. There's not really a lot of stability with the Lakers. They've been kind of a disaster. They did have the bubble championship. But by and large, LeBron's years in LA have been a disappointment, and I don't see that changing now suddenly. So you don't know how long of a leash you're going to have there. It's not very long. The Cavs gave JB 4.5 years, which is an eternity in terms of.
I think the Lakers have gone through 3 coaches in 4.5 years.
I mean, JB ranked. I think he was the 6th longest.
Yeah,
was it 5th?
Only 5 had been there longer.
5 been there
6th
longer.
longest tenured.
Yeah,
coach.
there was Pop, there was Kerr,
Spo,
and a couple others. JB was 6th on that list. So you're going to get, more than likely, you're going to get some stability here. It's a young roster. You have an owner that's willing to spend. They're probably going to be a tax team here sooner than later. So this, I believe, is a far more appealing job than the Lakers job, which, when did you ever hear that before? There's still a lot of cachet that comes with being the coach of the Lakers, particularly for people who maybe grew up on the West Coast or from that area, and there's a lot of them in the NBA from that area. But if you're just like comparing the 2 jobs side by side, I think the Cavs job's far better. Plus, it's in the East.
Yeah.
And the West was down for like a year or so, but now the West is roaring back. And the East, there's a much clearer path to success than there is in the West.
See, this is why I hate doing a show with Jason, because you let him go first on some things, and you know he's going to make a couple good points, but you don't think he's going to be a ball hog and take them all. And I had the East like ready to rock. Like, hey, the big thing you're missing is they're in the Eastern Conference. And next thing you know, Jason's like, oh, yeah, by the way, one more thing. I'm going to take it all. Jason nailed it, frankly. If you want to make – I don't think it's a giant gap. You may think it's a little bigger than me to coach LeBron in the West with Anthony Davis, 2 top 15 guys in the NBA. And let's be honest right now, if you were going to rank Donovan, LeBron, and AD, it's probably the two guys in LA,
Yes.
and then Donovan third. So
Yes.
you're getting the two best players in that equation. But when you take those two out of it, there's not a whole lot to work with in Los Angeles. You're also dealing with LeBron James, who, as good as he is, him and head coaches don't necessarily see eye to eye. Like, that's not a relationship that over the course of his career has been very fruitful for said head coach. Back here in Cleveland, if the Donovan commitment is there, you have Donovan, you have Darius, Jarrett, and Evan. If they're not all here, you're going to get pieces of value back for one or two, or I don't think three is possible, but three of those guys. You also have role players who you expect to play better in big moments. They can't play worse, Frank. I mean, George Niang literally can't play worse.
Yeah.
Like, literally can't play worse. Max Strus, I don't think can shoot worse. But if you look at the big picture, they're in the Eastern Conference. And look at the East right now. The Indiana freaking Pacers are in the Eastern Conference Finals because of a couple injuries. And next thing you know, they have one star player in Tyrese Halliburton and a bunch of role guys. I think the Cavs roster is better than Indiana. There's no reason the Cavs, with a little bit of luck, can't be in that exact position next year. That's going to wrap it up for the Ultimate Cavs Show. We appreciate you guys tuning in. Make sure you check out Earl's 216 show that starts at 5 o'clock. It's about, 40 minutes from now. Make sure y'all tune in for that. For Jason Lloyd, I'm Mikey McNuggets. We'll see y'all tomorrow. Peace.